Okay, so let's get to talking about these different groups of pathogens, ones that can cause disease. And the first group we'll talk about, of course, are the bacteria. Now, bacteria are a very large, very diverse group of unicellular organisms. They have their own kingdom or domain, however you want to look at that. The kingdom Prokaryota, or the domain Prokaryon, I think. So bacteria are unique in the fact that they don't have a true nucleus. All right, those are prokaryotic cells, so no true membrane-bound organelles, and certainly no nucleus. So their DNA is left to hang out in their cytoplasm. It does hang out in an area that we call a nucleoid, but it's not the same thing as a nucleus, so don't get that confused. In any case, bacteria are found literally everywhere. There's hardly a place on Earth, I don't think, that bacteria cannot live. They have such a diverse form of metabolism that they're suited to live basically everywhere. We could go around campus, and honestly, if we sampled anywhere at all, we would find bacteria growing. And that includes you, however, okay? We find them in the soil, we find them in water, we find them on the desks, everywhere you can imagine, but even more so, we find them on and in us. They're essential to human life, in fact. There's a project now, quite recently, called the Human Microbiome, and this project is a group of scientists, microbiologists who study bacteria that live on and in our body and how they affect our health. So we need bacteria for protection against other bacteria. In fact, sounds a bit strange, but if we have bacteria that live on our skin and live in our organs in some cases, and then they're happily there, they take up all the space. If a pathogenic bacteria or something that can really cause us harm comes around, then there's no space for those bacteria to live in. So our good bacteria outcompetes the bad bacteria. So we find bacteria that grow on our skin. We find them in huge numbers in our digestive system, especially in our large intestine. They're in our mouth, a very important part of our mouth. They can cause disease there, of course, gum disease, cavities and stuff like that in our mouth. But the bacteria that live on and in us, we call those our normal flora. And they're normal because they're fully expected to live on us and in us, and they represent a big part of who we are. In fact, if you were to look at the number of cells in our body and then compare that to the number of cells of bacteria that grow in and on our body, they outnumber us by an order of magnitude. That means 10 times more cells that aren't you that live on you. Now, if you have a look at this bacteria here, the question on the slide asks, what's the differences that you notice between an animal cell and a bacterial cell? And you guys should go through your notes and try and have a good understanding of that. I will remind you, however, though, if you think back to the lab where we looked at our cheek cells, and those are cheek cells with the fried egg squamous epithelial cells with the nucleus there. And when we looked at the pictures, you could see these tiny dots like that. Those are the bacterial cells. So keep in mind one thing when you're thinking about these differences is the fact in the size. The size makes a massive difference between a eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell. So please don't forget that. Like we've also talked about in lab, we kind of describe bacteria by their shape because it's quite hard unless you have a very powerful microscope to see much else. So very often we classify bacteria based on the way they look, their shape. So we get the cocci bacteria, which are the round, the circular shaped ones. And you can see those down in this picture right here. The next one we have are the rectangular or rod shaped bacteria. Sometimes you'll hear people call them cigar shaped, but they have a tendency to be elongated with round edges, so whoops, I missed, to that effect, and those are called the bacilli. And then finally we have the sporulli, and these are, we often say they're spiral shaped, but they can be curved, they can be C-shaped, they can be wavy. So a sporula can look like this, they can look like that, like we have down here, they can look like this. So there's a lot of variation on what a sporulli bacteria is. But that's one way that we classify bacteria, just by looking at their shape. So here's a slide showing bacterial shape and arrangement. I don't want you guys to worry about all of these, but some of these are certainly important. If we look at the cocci first, we can look at this group here called the streptococci. When we're talking about strep bacteria, that refers to bacteria that grow in chains or long strings. If we look down here on the bacilli, we've got streptobacilli, and again, they're growing in chains. Okay, so strepto is a configuration or an arrangement you should be aware of. Also, a very common group of bacteria we have are the staphylococci, and staphylo refers to growing in a cluster. So they actually look like a cluster of grapes, and that's where the word comes from. Staphylo refers to grapes. So these are some of the different shapes and arrangements that these bacteria can live in. The arrangements are usually caused by the way the bacteria divide. The way they divide can lead to the way they grow. They grow in these arrangements, and you can see here. They can grow in pairs that we call diplo. They can grow in groups of fours that we call tetrads, and it's all dependent on the way the bacterial cell divides. And then depending on what species it is, they have a characteristics to divide in certain ways that causes these arrangements. But you don't need to worry about everything on this page, but just make sure you keep in mind the ones that I highlighted. Now, bacteria are super interesting and super diverse organisms, and it's hard to narrow down exactly what bacteria do because they do so many diverse things. So bacteria have the ability to photosynthesize, so they can take light energy and convert it into their food, and they can do that on actually more ways than we generally think of photosynthesis. They're very, very interesting in terms of the way they can create their own food. They have the ability to create spores. Now this is very effective way for them to be pathogenic. A spore is bacteria's way of preserving itself. So if conditions are unfavorable, the bacteria will form a spore, and inside that spore it'll contain its genetic material and the structures that it needs in order to hibernate or go into a deep sleep for a long time and then wake up and become an effective cell again. So the conditions go bad, the bacterial cell realizes it's going to run out of food, it's probably not going to survive, so it forms a spore. Now that spore can stay dormant. I think scientists have found them dormant for thousands of years, and then they give them conditions that are favorable, so the right temperatures, water, some nutrients, and then those spores will germinate and become a living cell again. So the ability to create spores is a very, very effective weapon if you're a bacteria. And they can also grow in some really, really strange environments. Like they can grow without oxygen. They have metabolisms that can produce food and carry out metabolic reactions without having oxygen present. And these are all really impressive characteristics for living organisms. So here's a couple of pictures of bacteria. You can see them. Now these are the plates that we looked at in the lab when we're talking about diffusion in the solid. Now these are these agar plates. They're the same thing. We use them to grow bacteria. And on these ones we can see these little tiny circles that are growing here. Well, those are individual colonies, and those colonies can have hundreds of thousands of cells in them. Each one of those dots would be maybe millions of cells. And this is a very common bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus, and you'll find that on your skin. Quite common. But you can see different bacteria grow in different patterns and different shapes. So this is a bacteria called Proteus, and we can find Proteus growing in the soil. They're a quite common genus of bacteria that we can find all over the place. But they grow differently macroscopically, and then they'll look probably a little bit different if we look at them under the microscope. Now this is a scanning electron microscope, so an SEM micrograph of Bacillus species. So Bacillus, you can see it's got that bacilli shape, it's got that rod shape. And if you look really closely here, you can see that they have flagella as well. So you can actually see it. So this is a very, very powerful microscope. Now, the bacteria represent the largest group of disease-causing organisms, or pathogens, okay? And there's some certain groups that are of particular concern. So we have a species like Clostridium, for example, and that can cause a poisoning called botulism, which is really bad. It's very toxic, and we'll often find it associated with cans. So if food is improperly preserved, like a dented can or anything like that, and you eat it, you could get this toxic, you could get this poison, and it can be very serious. We got that species of Proteus that we just spoke about. Those are organisms that are quite commonly associated with urinary tract infections, UTIs. These bacillus species, there's many species of them, but one in particular, Bacillus anthracis, that can cause the disease known as anthrax. And then we have some other ones that can cause a little bit minor stuff. Pseudomonas, which is a very common soil bacteria. We also find it in natural waters like ponds and lakes. That can cause swimmer's ears or ear infections. If anyone's ever had strep throat, then they've had an infection by a bacteria called Streptococcus. And that can be really sore throat infection. And then we can have other ones called Staphylococcus. And you think about what we're talking about here. We look at the strepto. Remember that we said that grew in chains. We look at staphylo, which grow in clusters, and then coccus, which are going to be those circular shaped bacteria. So just by looking at the genus, we get a little bit of information about how these look and how they're arranged. And Staphylococcus is a bacteria that can cause toxic shock syndrome, which is a type of poisoning in the body. It's a systemic type of poisoning, and it can be very serious. It can be very deadly as well. But as we said before, bacteria, they're not all bad. We actually need bacteria to exist. We have a very close relationship with E. coli, Escherichia coli, that live in our guts, and the metabolites that the E. coli produce help us secrete certain vitamins. So it's absolutely essential that we have some of these bacteria living with us. If bacteria weren't present, then life as we know it on the planet would not be present as well. They're such an important integral group. They're absolutely necessary to sustain plant life, and without plants we wouldn't have oxygen, so you can see their importance. And I said before, our normal flora, that's the bacteria that cover us in our mouth, our skin, our hair, in our digestive system. Covers almost, well, it certainly covers every exposed surface on our body are covered by bacteria. Now, these normal flora, they will live happily on our body and in our body and never cause us disease. Okay, we've evolved a relationship with them over time where we're quite safe living with them. Now, that's not going to be the case if they get a chance to cause infection. So, for example, if you have a cut on your skin and you scratch it and you get these normal flora in there, then they could cause a local infection. Okay, so we often refer to them as opportunistic pathogens. That means if there's an opportunity for them to cause an infection, then they will go ahead and cause an infection. Okay, but like I said before, we get a certain amount of protection from these bacteria. If bacteria are living in a certain part of our body, and quite happily they get what they need, we're being protected. If a pathogen were to come along, then there's a good chance that it won't be able to establish living there, and then if it can't live there, then it won't be able to cause an infection. So our good bacteria will very often outcompete these opportunistic or these pathogens that come by. So they actually serve to keep us more safe by having them there. Also, they keep our immune system on alert. Our immune system is constantly being challenged by these opportunistic pathogens that live on us all the time, that our immune system is never just idling. It's always in first gear. It's always moving along, so that if something does come along, our immune system is already engaged. It's already ready to fight. So they do afford us a fair bit of protection. We should consider ourselves very lucky for. We'll also have bacteria that are present in our intestinal tracts, like I mentioned before, E. coli, and they help us break down food. We actually get more out of our food because some of the bacteria in our guts will ferment that food, and those products are good for us, so they help us. So although bacteria do represent the biggest group of pathogens known for us, they can also have a lot of serious benefits, and that we're only just really beginning to understand them right now. Alright, so in the next video we will talk about some more pathogens.